What a great gathering, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Hello, Dennis. I'm glad to have been here and heard you. I need to listen to Dennis once a year to be sure that I realize that I only know 1% of what's going to happen in the future, because Dennis knows 100% of all that. When Wendy told me that she was going to have Dennis beam in here for this convocation, I said that rather than coffee, she might have distributed Valium and with a Scotch chaser to get us kind of in the mood here. It's always bracing to hear Dennis's presentation, and I really appreciate it. And thank to Paul for a great and lively presentation from New Zealand. Let me take the, and I'm glad he reminded me, because as the preacher does, I will take the text this morning from Lao Tse, and that all truth lies in paradox. I've been reflecting on this a great deal, working with various organizations, most notably many of the intelligence communities in the United States, as they struggle with trying to help policymakers there understand the absolute disarray that they face in terms of the world and doing their job. And it's come to me that this paradox thing is probably something that we should be considering here these 2 days, and even in fact embracing. We generally think, and you've heard terms like complexity and nonlinearity and criticality and chaos and all of those things. And I think behind that assumption is that we are going, those of us who are trying to approach the future in an intelligent and productive manner, we're trying to replace one knowledge system with another. And the knowledge system that we have is based upon, of course, our human intelligence, the only intelligent species on the planet that we know of. There are reports that elephants are actually intelligent, but they don't tell us about that because they don't want to have all the problems that we have associated with it. What does our intelligence do? It takes a very complex phenomena, and it basically simplifies it and gives us knowledge of how to maintain and develop that phenomena. And that has been an extraordinarily valuable and productive, it is our species, and of course, as a result, we now dominate the planet and on the verge of dominating the solar system. There is an issue, however, in terms of the paradox, and that is that we may simplify things too much. And I guess the other phrase that comes to mind when I'm considering about the future in this context is, be careful what you wish for, because you may get too much of a good thing. And too much simplification, of course, is useful in some contexts, but after a while it becomes not just not effective, it even becomes harmful. And the fact that we are walking around in our heads and in our communities and in our governments and our companies with models of reality that used to be perhaps useful but are not useful anymore is a real danger, because we presume and we think that we know what we're doing, and in fact we don't. In many ways, we're like children playing with very, very explosive devices that we think we understand, but in fact those devices are really quite harmful. And so the approach is not to replace one knowledge system, simplicity and linearity, with another knowledge system, complexity and chaos, but rather to give up the hope that we can ever come to comprehend the realities that we're in and the future that we're facing. It's almost the abandonment of the ability to comprehend and to control. And as a person who releases themselves from an addiction, there is a release there. It sounds like something that is totally foolish, but it's also when we not just believe that we will understand the complexity, but we really distrust their ability to understand it all, that it becomes useful in how we are going to live in the world. And so the paradox is that our intelligence, which has gotten us so far, has created a world and an impact on our world which that intelligence is no longer capable of even understanding, much less controlling. So it's kind of like throwing ourselves into the arms of complexity and doing the best we can without hope that we will understand exactly what's going on or that we'll be able to control it. We have in our field of future studies a checklist of how we think about the world. Some people call it the STEEP categories. That's an acronym for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. There are others, PEST, epistle, pestle, all of those, all kind of acronyms that kind of tell us that the world is a complicated place. that all of those categories are changing simultaneously, and that each one is having an effect on each other one. So if that doesn't basically give us the point, the paradox that we will never understand it all, that it's too complex, and that we should stop trying to think we will and stop trying to act as though we do, we will be in a much better shape. I have a 7-point set of categories, which I use as a checklist, and I'll use that checklist to try and illustrate my point. The paradox has become common, and in fact, embracing the paradoxes is what we need to do in general, and certainly here over the next 2 days. And that little checklist is that people, obviously we are a people, living in a habitat, which we have described already, use technologies, which is our inventiveness and our ability to manipulate the habitat within an economic framework that makes decisions on production, distribution, and consumption, within a larger context of governance, community decisions, collective decisions we call government, and within the largest possible context of culture and values and norms that give us indeed our understanding of ourselves, our ability to communicate, and our decisions about what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. Now let me just illustrate some of the paradoxes that we are treated to today, and as just a backdrop. There's no solutions to these, but it is amazing how often paradox comes in to each one of these fields. So let's take demographics and the population. One of the greatest achievements of human history was the eradication of diseases in many parts of the world, and some completely, such as smallpox, the scourge of the 19th and the early 20th century. Antibiotics and other medical treatments, which we of course have in abundance, and that which in great humanitarian fervor we have distributed in many ways to many parts of the world, has produced, of course, the population explosion that we talked about. We now have approaching 7 billion on the planet. We will approach, and we will get to, without a catastrophe, 9 to 10 billion. So be careful what you wish for. The eradication of disease also produces its own set of issues and challenges. Within our own country, we have, of course, extended life expectancy from the 50s to the 60s and the 70s, and now the late 70s and the early 80s is common. People who are old can expect to live even much older. And again, a tremendous achievement of healthcare, medicine, nutrition, taking care of ourselves. And in the process now, we have created a society that has a lot less workers and a lot more people who are dependent on those, of which, and they consume the inordinate amount of health care. And we require, these are our parents, of course, and our grandparents, and our great-grandparents in some cases, whom we love and cherish, frankly, whom we hope the government does very well by them and takes care of them. Because if the government can't do that, guess where they're going to go? Into your house. So we have a paradox in which we have produced this tremendous life expectancy. No one wants to die, but at the macro level, we now have issues of Social Security and medical care and how much can governments. In the United States, of course, we celebrate and revere, almost to the point of sainthood, the people who created our republic. And were they to realize that 50% of the taxes that central government were to create is actually going to keep old people alive, I think that would have been the biggest surprise in their life. And I don't know whether the same is true in New Zealand. Of course, the second area is that we live in a habitat. And that habitat is, of course, the planet Earth. And we have figured out how to extract resources from that planet at ever-increasing rates. The image that I have is a vine that grows up around a tree that has lived a long, long time. And the vine not only uses the tree as its structural support, but also draws its nutrition from that. But the tree is no longer growing. The tree is, in fact, leveling off and someday will die. And the vine doesn't know where it's going to live and how it's going to live. We have been treated to the highest energy density, energy source of any civilization in the history of the human civilizations. Gasoline and crude oil and petroleum and natural gas and even coal are amazing. Of course, the name for those is not fossil fuels as we use it. We call it ancient sunlight. All of those were the product of our mother, the sun, beaming down on this planet over hundreds of millions of years, of which we are using that resource over hundreds of years. A 1/1,000,000th time speed of extraction compared to the speed of the deposit. A paradox that we have a resource and we are clever enough and ingenious enough to extract that resource to be able to fuel the complex and wonderful society that we have. The difficulty, of course, is that that resource is not infinite, and we will have to, as Dennis points out, figure out how to live in a complicated, high-energy society without the high-energy fuels that we've had before. He's right. The potential of wind and solar and geothermal and waves and all of that is there. I mean, the energy potential is huge, but the density is not. And harnessing that in any kind of a useful way is going to be a real challenge. And so it brings us to our technology, the technology that we so revere and use to increase are there paradoxes in technology? Well, of course. We create labor-saving devices and then work harder than before. We create communication devices that free us from the office and from the home, and yet they follow us everywhere we go. We're entering in this century not to the petroleum technologies and the information technologies, but to the biological technologies. And the paradox is that we may invent ourselves out of existence. We may so control the life force of this planet through genetic modifications of species and indeed ourselves that 100 to 150 years from now, we may not recognize ourselves. And that is an interesting paradox when we bring that technology not to machines and to plants and to energy sources, but to our very physical and biological bodies. Talk about issues, talk about challenges, talk about trying to be wise in how we implement that technology. So if you get your identity stolen because of a crook on Facebook is one thing, but actually have your genetic modification irreversibly changed because of a mistake, wow, that's a very, very frightening possibility. The economy that we have, of course, as I said, makes decisions. Every society has an economic system. The tribal societies had economic systems. They produce things and consume things. The Soviets, the feudal systems in the Middle Ages and in China and Japan all had economic systems that made those kind of decisions. Our economic system, again, is amazingly and fantastically productive. Through competition and innovation, we've produced a world, and given the high energy sources we've had, we've produced a world that is unbelievable, miraculous, compared to people 150 years ago. The irony is that we're not satisfied. The paradox is that were you to go back 100 years, you would see, indeed, how marvelous our economy and our standard of living is. Why can't we just relax? Because, in fact, the problem is that this economic system requires growth. We're like the shark that has to keep moving to be able to breathe. We need growth for investment and return, and so we are at a very, very high level of performance, but we're like on a train that has lost the throttle. We can't slow it down. We can't seem to pause. We can't seem to coast, because indeed, we're not only in competition with others, as Paul pointed out, but we're also in competition with ourselves, because every year has to be some percentage increment on the previous year. Now, there are many, many people in the world who are getting ready to participate in our economic life, and so we certainly do not want to deprive them of that. But we also feel competitive with them. And even though we've won the race, we're still running, and we may be running into extinction because we need more and more and more. How about the government? How about our governance system and our community system? The genius of democracy, the genius of those people who created the American system or the British system before that, was that they used the adversarial nature of humans as a balancing force against the acquisitive and dominating powers of humans. We call it the balance of power. The balance in our country between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive basically meant that no one was in charge and that all had to deal with each other. The British system that balances the Parliament, the judiciary, and the Crown in the same way. That adversarial system, again, has served us extremely well. But when the adversarial nature of the system becomes more important than the common good, then again, we are running way too far in one direction. And that may be the basis. You don't have the polarization quite that we do, but I don't think what I've heard the last few days, you're not particularly happy with your government either. And so the paradox is that we have used the adversarial system to get this far, but now it may be consuming and becoming the most important thing, which is to acquire power, maintain power, stay in office. For what? To acquire more power, to stay in power, and to maintain oneself in office. Now, those are jobs for those people. They have families, they have mortgages, just like we do. So I don't begrudge them the job. But isn't the job also to somehow find some counterbalance, not to do away with the adversarial system, but to figure out structures that don't let the adversarial nature of our government go so far? And finally, culture, language, values, norms. People have asked, so what have you thought about New Zealand so far? I arrived at 11 o'clock on Saturday morning, so I have tremendous opinions. Completely uninformed opinions. But given the seminar that we had the last 2 days and the participation of your two cultures, it has been remarkable that because of this small land and because of the relatively large proportion and the singularity of one of those populations, the Maori, this nation is really, really taking cultural differences seriously. And it's a heartening thing. I come from a country that has a huge heterogeneity and diversity, but because of that, it is not as sharply focused as yours. And so the paradox may be that the difficulties that have been historic between peoples of different lands, particularly when they colonize or when they migrate, may end up being one of your most tremendous achievements. The ability to actually live as two people in one land and to produce the community that you all want to achieve. So the bottom line is, be careful what you wish for. And most importantly, every solution, every valuable thing that we create, and the valuable things that we create here have a life cycle that oftentimes get out of control. We have too much of good things, and we have too little of other good things. The paradox and the complexity is that we will never be able to figure this out. We will never be able to come to a solution that will be able to figure out how we should go. But the good thing is, and the paradox is, that the discussion, the deliberation, the advocacy, the conflict, the disagreement that will occur in this room in these 2 days is the genius of the system that we have. You won't come up with an answer. You shouldn't come up with an answer. You should come up with a way forward. You should come up with a commitment to work together to participate in that way forward. And that's all we can get is a way forward, not a final destination. So this is a unique moment, as I said at the opening, during the opening ceremony. This is an historic moment. I hope people will look back on this week as a chance to say we've embraced the complexity of our lives and our world. There are challenges. So just like every success breeds its own failure, every challenge breeds its own success. We will not improve, we will not do the marvelous and wonderful things that we hope to and aspire to unless we are challenged by very, very significant challenges, much of which we have been treated to this morning. So I enter into this meeting and this gathering with a tremendous heart and a tremendous hope that in fact, as Brian said, we are not victims of the forces that we're talking about. They are important, but what I hope is that they inspire us to rise to the occasion and to embrace the difficult ways ahead so that we can be, as I said today, the good ancestors for the next 100, 200, 300 years in this land where they can look back on us and say, well, they weren't perfect, but they did a pretty damn good job for their time. I appreciate the time to share with you here in New Zealand, and thank you very much for the chance to share my thoughts.